Hello all, and I thought we would start off with looking at objective spirit with Hegel, since something like war, for example, is a hot issue, obviously, right now. And so something like war for Hegel, through objective spirit, is how a nation or a people become consciously aware of each other. And you can kind of think of examples of historical blunders, but on a more personal, maybe subjective basis, you see this online all the time with banting between different countries on the internet. These sort of stories and military expeditions, if you will, define us and give us that sense of identity. And obviously, in addition to war, is cultural norms, the relationships with the structures at hand in the greater context of the culture. That's what we were really getting at with objective spirit last time. And I wanted to take a step back and look at it on a phenomenological basis. The sort of description of conscious being, obviously the individual, and the objective, the national consciousness, if you will. But that all comes entail to God's own self-conscious, or God's knowledge, in that sort of tradition of theology with Aquinas. God's own self-knowledge, for Hegel, is experienced through our own self-knowledge of ourself. I guess to put it differently, of course, is that our own finite moment of self-consciousness is manifested through the Absolute Spirit's own consciousness, through God's knowledge of His own creation through us in the creation. It's this sort of panentheism, if you will. This is really important to get down to understand why Hegel is so revered in that sort of way. He steps away from divine intervention and creation, if you will, as compared to other Christian theologians, of course. Hegel obviously saw himself as a Lutheran Christian, but you can see in his process metaphysics here, though, that he has that sort of tradition of Christian Platonists and idealist metaphysics. But anyway, I digress. And so for Hegel, God's self-knowledge is the unfolding through the subjective spirit. And if God, is all-inclusive, then our own consciousness is just a moment in God's own knowledge of Himself. And I guess to put it in a different way, logic in its form of thought is synthesized in a kind of Hegelian metaphysics. You have logic as the form, synthesized with the substance of nature, the material world, the appearances, as it were, in front of us. Added on with the subjective spirit, the creative spirit, which also is the divine spirit, as he put it. in your own context, in the nation state, the in the context of the social structures around you. That is how one creates art, religion, and philosophy in this creative act of the human spirit, which of course is in tandem with the divine. And I think you could look at his different ways of seeing art, religion, and philosophy. Art is he has that sort of romantic notion of the images give us a different perspective that a literary example of thinking of images perhaps wouldn't be the same case, but whereas philosophy, of course, and it's kind of important to point this out since you can kind of see how art and philosophy could mix there. But for philosophy is on its own because it's the actual concept, this sort of attempt at making a concrete concept out of being itself. And that's of course different than just talking in metaphors or symbolism, of course, as it's going to come towards his ideas of religion. And obviously for Hegel, at this time in history, you have many different influences and findings, of course, of different histories and different sort of metaphysics, if you will, of Oriental pantheism, if you will, or sort of monistic, and obviously with the Christian Trinitarian. It's kind of interesting to see how Hegel and his contemporaries were dealing with, finding different histories and seeing how Hegel wants to describe them and describe their sort of history. This is ultimately how he goes about looking at art, religion, and philosophy as creations and movements of the absolute spirit. And I think if you take that into context, then you really will understand what Hegel's really trying to do. But now I wanted to really focus on the religion aspect, because Kant is directed as the person who gave us the idea of representation and the appearances of reality. And so for Hegel, religion is marked with the different symbols that he's observing historically through the different pantheism and monotheistic examples that he's seeing historically. And so religion is this the stand-in for reality through story and its symbolic representation. And this is important to grasp, because this is where Hegel is going to point out concepts like the death of God, which is of course famous, where you see the redemption of the transcendent deity dying, and its pictures and symbolisms for what that means in the redemption. So it's important to point that out, obviously, since it's going to be so influential later. It's also perhaps interesting, as an aside here, to point out really the beginning of the professionalization, if you will, of looking at art, religion, and philosophy, if you will, because I really think that this is the start of this sort of analytics to come out of this, and seeing that intellectuals to come since then don't really respect the metaphysics as they were, but more of just the sort of historical observation. So, for example, maybe look at someone like Joseph Campbell and his understanding of myth and the importance of story. Ultimately, and this isn't a knock on him, of course, or his character or anything, but he didn't actually, believe in these sort of stories. They're just these sort of almost utilitarian. Myth is good for the human soul, but it's more about the sort of symbolic understanding, the sort of symbols are important to the human conscious experience, if you will, as opposed to the religion, as it were, belief and faith. It's also interesting to point out maybe a division, if you will, between history and faith as history unfolds and more cultures are introduced and their influences. Obviously, with the West in particular, the West, I think, uniquely wants to try to capture it all, if you will. That's why, ironically, in its sort of own way, only a Spengler-like figure can come out of the stage of something like that, for him to be able to see and classify these civilizations already requires that sort of upbringing on its own. But I'm drifting a bit too far here. But I just wanted to touch up on the absolute spirit and how Hegel saw art, religion, and philosophy, because I think it's important to see its influence in the future, and obviously in future videos, towards existentialism, for the phenomenology aspect, of course, as we'll see, but also with how we treat art, religion, and philosophy since. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. The next one will be a bit about the heirs of Hegel. I think we'll touch up on people like Marx, for example, and his influence, and some of the other post-Hegelians. But yeah, thanks for watching.